Welcome to Subversive Clarity. I'm Simon Esler. I have spent years studying the war on children, also known as the war on innocence. I felt strongly about starting this series with a full episode focused on the kids and with a case study that deeply informs us about the systemic ways we are failing to honor and protect our children and their innocence. With the Epstein files opening eyes around the world to the reality of normalized child abuse in the halls of power, it's important to bring our situational awareness home to see how this war on children is manifest locally. While I do advocate for using the Epstein files as a resource for awakening the masses to that which has remained hidden, I think it's essential not to let the outrage machine embedded in our algorithms distract us from what's happening in our own backyards. As the indomitable Boone Cutler always emphasized, you have to focus on your 30-meter target. If we are all focused on 5,000-meter targets, the takedown of elites that are not an existential threat to the children in our own families and communities, then we are potentially failing the very children we are uniquely positioned to help. Monique, my guest today, has been focused explicitly on that mission, using the growing awareness of systemic, normalized child abuse as a call to action in her own community. Today, Monique and I are collaborating on a particular scandal that few have heard of, the scope of which has yet to be properly reported on. The Robert Land Academy military-style boys' school is a perfect case study in the institutionalization of child abuse and the laws that enable it. Boys at the school were outright tortured, sexually, physically, and psychologically. Force-fed detergent and their own vomit, beaten, bruised, and bloody, stripped naked in front of teachers in the freezing cold, raped and threatened. The list goes on. Perhaps more shocking is that this school had the backing of the community's most powerful institutions and individuals, from the Canadian Armed Forces to the local police, and even conservative leadership on the board. Very dark questions remain as to how a school that used torture as a way to help troubled boys was allowed to operate for over half a century, only closing down in 2025. Even as the boys begged their parents for help, the school gaslit the parents, using preemptive letters and phone calls to seed fake narratives, accusing the boys of avoiding accountability and discipline with lies. Sadly, the world is now filled with broken men, who, as boys, were sent into this hellhole. Many have committed suicide or succumbed to drug abuse and alcoholism. Even worse, it's likely that some have become abusers themselves. Fortunately, a group of remaining survivors are on the path to exposing this, with active lawsuits building proper momentum and a recent investigation being announced. I am working to get at least one of the survivors on this show as soon as I can. Thank you for joining me on Subversive Clarity. I hope this episode moves you to be of service to the kiddos. Thank you. Thank you for joining me, Monique. If you want to just start off, give people a sense of who you are, what kind of mission you're on right now so that people can have some context before we get into anything deeper.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much, Simon, for having me. I really appreciate you giving me a platform to speak. So I am a mom of two girls, recently became a grandmother, and I've been an activist and kind of citizen journalist for the past 6 years, I guess now. And my organization, Moms Resist, formed about 4 years ago. This was just, during the COVID era, when we saw the kids were being affected by lockdowns, mandates, medical intervention. And, as mothers, we could see that children were suffering psychologically, developmentally, emotionally. And we as mothers wanted to put a stop to the government overreach that was occurring and start really governing over our children and what was best for them. You know, a lot of children suffered through that time. Suicide went up, child abuse, neglect. A lot of parents were even, you know, relapsing that had been on, you know, the right path for quite some time. So a lot of, you know, children were in hospitals. You know, I spoke to a lot of nurses at that time, Simon, as you know, and the one of the nurses, she worked at the hospital in Barrie, RVH, said that they saw a drastic increase in children trying to kill themselves. Um, and so we as parents saw something very concerning, and that's how Mums Resist was formed. So we took a few initiatives at that time. We did a couple of marches in Toronto, just vigils, holding candles, singing Amazing Grace, you know, with affected children. And that's kind of a little bit of background about how we started. Recently, Mums Resist saw, uh, you know, this this was really in the recent, like in light of the recent release of the Epstein files, that we now wanted to kind of shift gears. Although it's always been about defending and protecting children, uh, we now are focused on ending child exploitation and child trafficking, which is a huge issue, not only globally, it's a foreign and it's a domestic issue. It's happening here in our own backyard, in our communities. And having really looked into these issues and being immersed in this, I don't think Canadians are aware of how massive of a problem this is in our country, how lax our laws are against child sexual predators, how there's strict criteria around the Amber Alert system and how that is issued, how child sex predators are being released into neighborhoods constantly around parks, schools, children, and the reoffend rate is 1 in 4. So majority of these people are very high risk and will reoffend. So our children are in danger. There are over 600 registered sex offenders in Hamilton, Ontario, where a judge just ruled that making the National Sex Offender Registry public would be unconstitutional. Therefore, protecting the privacy of these people who commit these heinous crimes over the children who these crimes were committed against and the potential future victims, which are innocent.
Okay, so we have this issue, it looks like in Canada, where this is something I've been tracking in my own research that children aren't really protected through the lens of parental rights at all. So I know that there's no laws in Canada that have anything to do with parental rights, which
Right.
personally I've seen as a huge gap, because at the same time, there's this framing of children as sovereign individuals, as political entities. So the whole children's rights framing in our legal system is, on the one hand, very shaky because it's often being used to actually separate children from the family. And then on the other hand, we have laws that seem to be, I guess, focused on what they would call restorative justice. That's the claim, at least, is that when punishments are too harsh, then the offender doesn't, they don't actually get better. And so they've taken this angle as an opportunity to now be much lighter in their sentencing for sex offenders and all sorts of criminals, to be honest.
Mhm.
Um, what do you understand the judge's reasoning to be in the Hamilton case when it comes to protecting the rights of child sex, offenders?
So, to my knowledge, Simon, I think this case was in regards to a certain specific individual. So I guess in the judge's eyes, he wasn't high risk. And there are some that aren't, that they shouldn't be put on this sex offender registry, that could potentially be made public, which is something that is being considered right now, right? So there is a member of parliament by the name of Fred Davies, who is the one that is supporting the petition. So that is my understanding of it. However, uh, you know, we need to consider the protection of children, all children, and these crimes that are being committed, no matter how big or small a judge thinks, um, it destroys a child. It destroys childhoods. And we cannot continue to allow this to happen because traumatized children become traumatized adults. It is something that remains with you, and it takes immense healing to recover from the damage it causes to a child.
So I've looked a little bit into this debate, and there seems to be tension between making the sex offender registry totally public versus customizing it for certain levels of offenders. So in your communications with MPs and in your push, what is the framework that you think we should be fighting for here? Is it something that should be more broad, or is it a system that will pick a certain level of offender?
No, I personally believe every offender should be on that list. Um, and, this is my opinion, and some might disagree with me. Um, but I think anybody who is able to commit an offense against a child should be, um, people should be made aware of that, right? And I don't think that they should just be able to walk in our societies without, us being made aware of that. So we as parents can protect our children. Like you just said earlier, it's like parental rights are being stripped away. And, it's like, when are we going to be able to, we birth these children, we raise these children, we love these children. We need to be able to protect them if our government is not. And, that's our right. So we are asking for the government to consider this. And in my honest opinion, Simon, I can't imagine that there's really any MP or member of government that wouldn't agree with protecting children over sexual predators. I have to ask that question as to what reason would you have to not protect children and to protect the sexual predator? And the only answer I can come up with is that they they agree with with protecting child predators, right?
I think too, one of the important backdrops to identify here is that child sexual abuse, child sex trafficking, especially online, is on the rise. I mean, this is something that is increasing in Canada. There is a struggle to keep up with it. I know that law enforcement is really struggling with, abusive scenarios online, that there's online cults that have been recruiting children into horrible things, and that they're struggling to keep up with it. Um, but it is so important, I think, to recognize that this is a problem that is rising as judges like this are more focused on, defending the sex offender themselves. So that's the sort of context. I think in Canada, we've had this struggle for many years now. Like you said, COVID, I think, brought a lot of this out. I personally, I went to I remember going to the 1 million March for Children protest.
Mm-hmm.
And I made a short documentary on this because when I went there, the counter protesters were all active Marxists. And so for me, it was helpful for the public to understand that the counter protest was coming from an actual communist Marxist ideological stance. But what was interesting there was that it was Christians and Muslims, families of different faiths coming together to demand changes to the curricula. which is another whole backdrop to all this, is that we have school curricula that is increasingly sexualized. And I
Mhm.
think, all of this context matters because I think, we're going to get into the story of this, the Robert Land Academy briefly, but I really want to set up this backdrop here because we also have this struggle with the schools not only increasing the sexual nature of curricula, but at the same time looking to give the school more power over the child and taking away the parental rights. So there's been a struggle in a number of provinces when it comes to transitioning children, socially transitioning children. There's even some cases of schools helping to medically transition children and wanting a precedent that allows them to hide that process from the parents. And, I think all of this is really important context because the way that things are moving in Canada, they're using the idea of children's rights to give the children more over to the state and further away from parental guidance. And I think,
Well, they
you know,
sorry, yeah.
yeah,
They think children are at like they're giving decision making
yeah,
um to children that when it comes to things that should be decided on as adults, right? Like, and it's also we're seeing normalization of sexualization of children and then the desensitization of the our society really. And so when it comes to providing sexually explicit content or material to a minor, it is illegal under the criminal code under section 171.1 in the criminal code. However, there is a gray area that if it's being provided as educational purposes and falls under the curriculum, then it's not criminal. But a lot of what you just said is that we are seeing that there's been some, things that have slipped through. And there's been definitely questions raised, and there's even been an organization that apologized for the pamphlets that they were giving out in schools after backlash from the parents. So yes, there are multi layers to this issue, Simon. I would 100% agree with you. And again, we need to now, as parents, empower parents to take our power back and govern over our children, right? Like we decide what is best for our children, not our government, not teachers, not the schools. We, the parents, decide what is best for our children.
this seems to be at the heart of the struggle in Canada right now. There is this, it's almost a philosophical change in the way that they're viewing children. So you have what they call the mature minor doctrine, right? And this is a big sort of foundational legal angle that is often used to separate child from parents. And the mature minor doctrine, really, there's no age range at all. And it claims that if a child is deemed to understand the consequences of something by an expert, by someone outside the family, then they can do things like medically transition. They can get vaccines without the parents. I recently found out that it's standard at places like Sick Kids Hospital to cut off parental access to medical records once a child turns 13, and you have to fill out all these forms to get access to that. Um, I think it's important for people to understand that the ideological foundation to all of this, it's Marxist in the sense that it frames the family as a site where oppression is propagated, right? There's this old communist idea that the family unit is where oppression is duplicated and passed on the generations. And we have a lot of government officials that are deeply steeped in this Marxist idea of family, which is the justification. A lot of the ways that predators are getting access to children is because they are getting to know them and are manipulating them, especially with the online abuse. And I
Yes.
honestly think that a lot of parents would be able to protect their children better if they had deeper relationships with the children themselves. And just the way that our society has normalized, for example, children being away all day at school and all of that in their most formative years, to me, there's like a longer game that's been played in giving children up to the state. And I think the good news is that you can bring your children closer, you can raise them yourself, you can take action on their education, and that is a huge first line of defense in my experience. I'm seeing a lot of that, a lot of parents taking control of their children's education as one way of protecting them more deeply from
Mhm.
what's going
I
on.
think that's so important. I think it's so important to keep your children home if you can. Unfortunately, not all parents can, and that's the problem. But you're seeing that, yeah, like we talk about the state taking over. Well, like the boys, for example, that fled Robert Land, they were returned by the police back to the school. We're seeing incidents of CAS getting involved, even when it comes to like medical intervention, like some parents who are refusing vaccines or, certain things, we've seen CAS come in. Parents that have, do not agree with the whole transitioning issue. We've seen there's some stories of parents being removed from their children's lives for that. And so again, like red flags, slippery slope, please wake up, because the more we allow these things to happen, the more control they will gain, and the more power they will gain over our children, and removing us from the nuclear family, from that equation, and putting them and interjecting themselves.